Please welcome Ben Buchanan to the S417 main stage.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My right hand is all warmed up to sign those copies tomorrow. So I'm just talking today. Don't worry about that. And what I'm here to do, what I do most of the time, is I study how nations, particularly their intelligence community and their militaries, operate in cyberspace. And it's a pleasure to be here. Dale asked me to talk a little bit about the subject of cyber nationalism, how national interests play out in cyberspace and often play out in ICS networks. Before I get to the nuts and bolts of operations, I want to take a big step back and ask a rhetorical question, but an important one. If I asked you to summarize the entire 20th century in one sentence or one phrase, what would you say? If you're a technologist and if you're an optimist, you'd probably say something like bringing people together or connecting the world. And you could point from trains to cars to planes and eventually to the internet as a means to which this is done. The internet, of course, is maybe the most significant of those. It's short for internetwork, which gives a sense of the discrete and disparate communities that get brought together with technology. But I'm not just a technology person. I spend a lot of time with historians and political scientists at Harvard, and if you ask them the question, they'd probably say something a little bit blunter. They might say, don't mess with nationalism. And nationalism is this notion that groups can come together and form a nation, often around some grievance or through some conflict, and that nation will compete in the international system with other nations. And they'll struggle, sometimes violently, sometimes not, to do diplomacy, to do war, to do all the things that we expect our nations to do. And political scientists have a key term that they use to describe the system, which is anarchy. Not chaos, but anarchy, the lack of a ruler that sets rules, that's an external arbiter for events. In short, at the end of the day, nations have to provide for their own security. They have to advance their own interests. Smaller nations will band together in security umbrellas, but at the end of the day, the tip of the spear, particularly for big, strong nations, they have to provide for themselves. And there aren't rules on how they do that. So with that backdrop, with that political science 2-minute talk, let's think about how that applies to cyberspace and how that applies to the digital domain that we all operate in. In other words, if you don't care about political science, if you don't care about geopolitics, I would submit that by the end of this talk, you'll believe that geopolitics cares about you. So I've divided this into 3 presentations, or 3 propositions. You can follow along and tell me exactly where you disagree. But the goal of doing it in that way was to make it clear, so when you're agreeing and when you're disagreeing, you know exactly what you're dealing with. We'll talk a little bit about offense, how nations break in on the offensive side and why they do it. Talk a little bit about defense, how nations use cyber operations to break in for defensive reasons, and how they do defense at a very sophisticated level. And we'll talk about why all this is threatening, why this matters to people who don't really care about technology, care about national security, why they're interested in technology and why they've started to care a lot about it and use it as a tool of statecraft. So without further ado, let's get to proposition number 1. My argument in this proposition is that nations that want a cybersecurity or cyber operations capability during a time of conflict or potential conflict need to break in, need to launch a network intrusion in advance of that conflict. Now, there's a couple reasons for this, for why I think this proposition is true. If you hang around in Washington, D.C. as much as I do, you'll hear people talk at Congress and policymakers all the time about how cyber war takes place at the speed of light. Cyber war, whatever that is, goes really, really quickly, and how this changes a lot of things. And I argue that's just not true. Parts of cyber war, whatever that is, take place at the speed of light. But many parts don't. Often the part that goes very fast is the last part. And all the stuff that goes up to that goes quite slowly and requires a lot of effort. And these earlier steps, breaking in, gaining access, pivoting through the network, stealing credentials, whatever it is, I submit that these steps have less momentum than the kinds of conventional military operations that national security policymakers are used to thinking about. And if you think about launching a bombing run, well, when the jet's on the runway, there's not too much momentum. You can call that bombing run off at any time. When you have the airplane take off and cross into enemy airspace, now you've got to worry about fuel. And if you're in contested airspace, you've got to worry about the enemy shooting it down. So there's a momentum once you actually start invading and crossing into enemy territory. There's a use-it-or-lose-it capability that is quite stark and quite immediate. And you take a risk. I argue the risk you take in cyber operations is much less. And the need for preparation is much greater. If you want to have the cyber capability, you need to break in early, because there's a tight linkage between collection and attack. If you want to have a developed capability, a targeted capability, one that has a tailored effect, you need to do reconnaissance first. For those of you who know the basics of the kill chain model or the ICS kill chain model that Mike Asante and Rob Lee talk about, this is pretty basic stuff. This is a sea change if you come from a conventional military background, where a fighter plane works just the same in the Atlantic as it does in the Pacific, and where you can retarget a missile or a nuclear weapon pretty easily. The idea that you need to do a lot of reconnaissance and preparation of the enemy's environment, the enemy's terrain first, is a pretty recent idea in military affairs, and I think it's sharpest in cybersecurity. So in wrapping up this proposition, let's put a very fine point on it. If you want to have a capability 6 months from now, that's a cyber capability that's particularly advanced and targeted, you need to break in now. Actually leave your space, break into red space, and gain access and start doing reconnaissance on the enemy's network. So this is a fundamental characteristic, I argue, of how high-end offense works, particularly targeting ICS devices because of the complexity involved in doing those kinds of tailored operations. The number of canonical examples here, Stuxnet, the attack in Ukraine, this crowd knows them as well as anyone. But those represent a sea change in a lot of ways in military thinking in a conventional context. So if we get to preposition number 2, we shift the focus to defense. There's a lot of things that we do to defend ICS networks. You might set up perimeter defenses. You might set up air gaps. You might manage your net flow material, network security monitoring. All the things that are usually talked about at a conference like this are really important. And they're absolutely, or they should be a baseline if they're not already. But remember that I said nations don't have rules in how they conduct their intelligence affairs. So if they want to defend a critically important network, they often go a little bit further in ways that probably would be illegal for you to do if you run a power company or a water system. Particularly, I argue in proposition number 2 here, nations have an incentive, and indeed do, intrude into other nations' networks for the purposes of improving their defenses. Not just to set up offensive attacks, as I described in proposition number 1, but to improve their defenses. And got a couple quotes here that allude to the general possibility, and I'll get to some specifics. The US cyber czar, Michael Daniel, said that if you know a lot about cyber, very easy to defend against. You can generate signatures, you can see the enemy attack coming, and you can block it. So that's why on the offensive side, the US keeps its capabilities so secret. The NSA will acknowledge, and even President Obama acknowledged when he gave a speech at the NSA, that a lot of what the US does when it breaks in is inform its defensive mission. So there's sort of a high-level picture that, yes, intrusions are useful for defense. But the key point here is that it changes how the dynamic works between intruder and defender. Because suddenly the defender is an intruder too. The defender has privileged information. The defender seizes the initiative. And this reminds me of a story about the great American chess grandmaster Bobby Fischer, probably the best American ever to play chess. And he said that he only got good at chess. He only really figured out chess at a sophisticated level when he realized that when he was playing as the black pieces, so the pieces that move second, he had just as much right to the initiative to dictate the course of the game as the white pieces, the piece that moved first. And again, this is illegal for most people to do. But when you're in the international system, I submit the same thing is true in cybersecurity. The best defense, the truly sophisticated defense, involves penetrating other sides' networks, gaining threat intelligence you can't get any other way, and seizing the initiative. And we'll talk about what the effects of that mean and why it probably should be illegal for companies to do it in a couple minutes. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, Ben. We are pretty far from ICS here. You're just talking about two nations doing counterintelligence and NSA hacking the Chinese equivalent and vice versa. That doesn't really have to relate too much to ICS. It's just sort of nationalism, not very much critical infrastructure. Which leads me to another wrinkle. You can extend proposition number 2, and you can say it's not just, there's not just incentives to hack your adversary, which is often very hard to do, but there's incentives to hack your adversary's target. Because in fact, your adversary is so hard to hack. So if the NSA can't get into Chinese networks, or the Chinese can't get into NSA networks, the next best thing is for the NSA to go find some Chinese targets that are not the NSA, and for the Chinese to go find some NSA targets that are not China, and to broaden the network of intrusions that you launch for defensive reasons to gather information on how your adversary operates, so you can develop signatures, so you can understand their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and so you can understand their tradecraft in a way that enables you to block it. And this is where ICS networks come immediately back into the picture. Because if you believe proposition number 1, that the most sophisticated nations have good reason to intrude into ICS networks and to intrude into networks they might want to attack in advance of conflict, then this part of proposition 2 makes a lot of sense. If you want to understand how those nations operate and you can't get into their red space, you want to pick out where they're operating against third parties that are hopefully reasonably soft targets. And you want to break in there and see what you can learn. And there's a lot of evidence, or at least some evidence, that this is the case. Kaspersky Labs, the cybersecurity firm that most of you probably know, published a report called The Magnet of Threats, which noted that one computer of particular interest, they didn't say what it was, had been penetrated by 5 different major cybersecurity actors. Essentially, everyone had interest in this computer. And I would submit that most of them probably had interest in that computer. But if they're smart, they also had an interest in the other parties that had an interest in that computer. And if you look at some of the information we have on sophisticated tool chains across the Five Eyes, we do see that this is borne out. So this broader concept, this what I call third-party counter-computer network exploitation, is a pretty powerful thing. And it plays out on the soft targets of the world, which relatively speaking are often ICS networks, which are soft targets at least compared to intelligence community networks. So there's an incentive here to intrude very broadly for defensive reasons, not just into your adversary's network. And in fact, sometimes intruding into your adversary's network can tip them off that you're after them. So you don't want to do that. You want to find the third parties and then poke around there and see what turns up. So that's proposition number 2. We can turn now to third and final proposition. Intrusions threaten. All of this stuff here would be a purely academic or technical discussion if you don't believe this third proposition. No one in Washington, D.C., no policymaker, no intelligence community chief would care if intrusions weren't threatening. So it may seem obvious that intrusions are threatening, that when you suffer an intrusion, if you're running a critically important network, whether that's ICS or whether that's a vital government network, that you'll feel threatened and you'll, in some cases, make it an item of national policy to figure out how to respond. But it's worth being a little bit rigorous about thinking about how we think about this threat. So I've divided the threats from intrusion into 4 areas. The first is that they can enable a specific cyber attack. They can enable the tailoring and reconnaissance that's required to have a well-developed ICS attack. This is proposition 1, just showing up here from the other side of the ledger. It's great to be able to break in, to develop the capability, not because you want to attack, just because you want to have a deterrent or contingency plan. The flip side of that is it's terrible to have someone in your network who might be able to be doing those things to you. So the capacity to do preparation of the environment is very threatening. And American documents such as Presidential Policy Directive 20 and military documents on preparation of the environment bear this out. Again, these are sort of wonkish, buried policymaker documents, but they're out there, and you can get a sense for how nations like the US think about this, both from doing it, but also from being threatened by it. Admiral Rogers of the NSA and Cyber Command notes that they detect foreign adversaries, sophisticated adversaries in US infrastructure, and he said, why are they in there? And the direct quote is, they're giving themselves the option if they want to act. So this is a very threatening thing, and probably the most threatening potential effect if you run an ICS network. for all the reasons that conferences like this are really good at spelling out. The second thing is that they can serve as a beachhead for future operations. That even if you break into a network with no intention of developing an ICS attack, no intention of learning about the environment, you're simply looking for other adversaries who are in that network, you're doing the third-party counter-computer network exploitation I talked about, the access you gain from breaking in can reasonably quickly be converted into something else. Not nearly something as sophisticated or as tailored as if you were doing proper reconnaissance, but you could probably do a wiper attack. And within the frame of international politics, wiper attacks have become quite significant. Certainly Sony and North Korea, by any standard we would talk about at a conference like this, not a terribly technically sophisticated event, but politically very important. Certainly something like the attack Shamoon on Saudi Aramco, or the attack on Sands Casino in December 2014. Again, not sophisticated technical attacks, but show the damage that could be done with this level of access, basic level of access, and showed how that basic level of damage is significant enough to reach the concern level of national policymakers. So that's the second thing you can do, is you can have your defensive access and turn it in a moment of crisis to some basic level of offensive access. Go from collecting information to attack. And it's a tight linkage between collection and attack that makes cyber operations in some ways very different than, say, airplane operations or satellite operations. A third way in which an intrusion can do harm is it can change the tenor of future conflict and competition. Less relevant for ICS networks, very important for government networks. If a nation breaks in, it can steal secrets that it uses to inform its economic competition, to inform its political conflict, and sometimes to inform its military conflict. And the United States Defense Science Board has published a lot about the risks of doing this and the critical dependencies in US systems that need to be protected, some of which are ICS systems, and how if an adversary were to get in there and take those secrets out, it would very much change the tenor of a future military or political conflict. The fourth bit of damage that can come from an intrusion, again, is more localized to intelligence networks, but these are enormous counterintelligence risks. If someone breaks in, steals your secrets, they know what you know and how you know it, that fundamentally changes how they react to you, how they anticipate your moves, and how things play out at an intelligence level. So not a broader military conflict, but just focused on intelligence. And US documents are pretty clear that this is a mission for Cyber Command, for DoD, to do counterintelligence on foreign nations. Other nations, which are not democracies, are obviously much more closed-lipped about what it is they do, but I think it's a safe bet to say the Russias and the Chinas in the world spend a lot of time trying to figure out how US intelligence works. This is where the third-party intrusions can come into play, and once again, it links back to ICS networks. If their capacity of spying on the NSA is to spy on the NSA's targets, or their capacity of spying on the Chinese is to spy on the Chinese targets, which might be American computers, then suddenly this intelligence battle of wits intrudes again, without actual network intrusion, onto ICS networks. So that is proposition number 3. So let's take a step back here, and then I will wrap up. You can put these 3 propositions together and come to what I hope is a reasonably fluid argument. You can say, on one hand, nations have very good reasons to break in early for offensive power. They want to develop the capacity to attack because they're either planning on launching an attack, or because they want a deterrent, or because they want a contingency plan. So they've got good reason before there's conflict, before there's tension, if it's at all plausible and they have the resources, and I acknowledge it's very expensive to do this, to break in early, get that access. It's better to have the access and not need it than to need it and not have it. So that's proposition 1. Proposition 2, same thing but for defense. It's good to break in early, to understand how the adversary operates, to understand their tradecraft, where they might be going next, purely for defensive reasons. You don't want to do damage, you don't want to strike, you don't even want the possibility of doing that, but you do want to protect your own networks very well. The problem is that both of those things are very threatening, and they're very hard to tell apart. So a nation might suffer an intrusion and not know why the other side is breaking in. Is it breaking in because they're planning a no-kidding cyber attack, and this is the one capacity and the one opportunity to stop it? Are they breaking in because they want to establish a deterrent? Are they breaking in because they just want to poke around and see what they can find? And maybe they're not even interested in your country at all. They're interested in another country, another country's operations, which might plausibly be against your country. So the web of interpretation here is very difficult. And this is what political scientists call the dilemma of interpretation, where another nation, a nation sees an action by another nation and needs to figure out what the intentions are behind that action. And it's very difficult to learn intention sometimes from just activity. If we tie this all together, there's this notion of the security dilemma. Michael Asante this morning gave a great talk, I thought, about the sword of Damocles from ancient Greece. I'll do one in the similar vein as well. There was a Greek historian, Thucydides, who was the first great historian, really, of all humanity. And Thucydides talked about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And Thucydides said that the Peloponnesian War was inevitable, because as Athens rose, Sparta, which was then the dominant power at the time, got worried. Athens was going through, it was a city-state, not really a nation, but it was going through its own kind of advancing national interests. Sparta, which had to protect its own national interests, got worried. And the Athenians could never convince the Spartans that their intentions were not to overrun Sparta, and vice versa. It's this rising power that made it inevitable. As Athens did things to defend itself, it unintentionally threatened Sparta, and vice versa. And this, Thucydides said, and international relations theorists have worked it out in much more formal detail since then, is a security dilemma. You provide for your own security, but you threaten another nation's. And that's because it's a self-help system. It's an anarchic system. There's no one for a big nation to turn to. They have to defend themselves. So we have two of these security dilemmas, I would argue, in cyberspace, two cybersecurity dilemmas. And I don't want to belabor too much of the book here because I'm not here to sell books. You're already all getting them. And the notion is that as you intrude for offensive reasons, you might just want a deterrent, but the other nation suffering the intrusion will feel threatened. If you intrude for defensive reasons, you might threaten another nation that thinks it's for offensive reasons. If you intrude into a third party for defensive reasons, you might threaten that nation, even though you're not even interested in defending against that nation. So the broad network of intrusions suddenly leads to a risk of escalation, and maybe even to conflict. As cyber capacities get more developed, as more nations come online, we'll see how the risks of escalation and the potential harms play out there. Now, let's tie this all back to ICS, and then I'll wrap up. Why does this matter if you're an ICS professional? Because unlike every other past security dilemma, unlike the Greeks, which were fighting it out on the oceans, or unlike the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War, which fought it out in submarines under the seas, or satellites in space, or fighting dogfights over Korea or Vietnam, the cybersecurity dilemma plays out in intelligence community networks. Okay, we don't have to worry about those. And it plays out in ICS networks and other networks of critical importance. Because ICS matters so much, because these critical networks matter so much, they become offensive targets and they become critical defensive targets. This suddenly means that even if you're running a private network with no interest in geopolitics, suddenly you've got to worry about defending against sophisticated adversaries that are bringing to bear the might of nation states against you. And you need to figure out to what degree your federal government is going to help you do that, to what degree you want them to, what liability you have, and how it's going to play out at a technical level. So I would submit that in a lot of ways, the challenges that we face in ICS go back to broader geopolitical challenges that truly matter, and that whether we like it or not, are not going away simply because of the nature of the international system. So I said, how would you describe the 20th century in one phrase or one sentence? And there's different ways to look at it of varying degrees of optimism. When you describe the 21st century, 100 years from now, and look back, I'm not sure that cybersecurity and ICS will be in the sentence description of it, but I'm willing to bet that if you wrote a paragraph about the 21st century, these subjects would be right in there, probably the second or third sentence. In other words, all of this stuff geopolitically is too important to ignore, which means technically it's vital to get it right. Thank you very much.